Mohan Giridharadas earned an MBA from Stanford, and he was a senior director for years at McKinsey. But it took an insight from a casual conversation at a Silicon Valley cocktail party to give him the direction for Lean TaaS, where he's founder and CEO. A decade and $200 million of investment later, the company is leading the way in operational optimization of healthcare assets. In healthcare, big organizations often use pencil and paper or Excel spreadsheets for tasks like scheduling infusion centers, and the results are predictably dismal. Lean TaaS applies the more sophisticated approaches used by companies like UPS and Delta Airlines to bring healthcare into the modern era. Mohan shares his life and career story in this episode of the Health Biz Podcast. I'm your host, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. We help fast-growing companies like Lean TaaS make informed strategic decisions. If your healthcare or life sciences company needs strategy consulting support, please contact me, dwilliams at healthbusinessgroup.com. So, Mohan Giridharadas from Lean TaaS, welcome to the Health Biz Podcast. How are you today?
Terrific. Great to be here, David.
Listen, we're going to talk all about the exciting things that you're up to now, but I want to wind back the clock a little bit, if you don't mind. Give people a sense of how you got here, because you've got quite a background, some of which I've seen on your resume, and others which I'm looking forward to learning about. And I'd just be interested to start off with your upbringing, your education. What were your childhood influences like, and how did you decide what you were going to do for your schooling?
I grew up in India. I knew from age 10 I'd be an engineer. My dad's an engineer. All three of my older brothers are engineers. And so I just was on the path to studying for and entering the IIT in Bombay. So I studied electrical engineering as an undergraduate. Came directly after that to the US for graduate school in computer science at Georgia Tech. They had a terrific computer science program, and I got to work with fabulous faculty. Went off to Intel first after that as a software engineer, and then at Mentor Graphics as a software engineer. Went on to Stanford for business school, and then joined McKinsey. And stayed at McKinsey a very long time, 18 years before starting Lean TaaS in 2010.
Yeah, it's good. Well, it's funny how the time moves along. So it sounds like you had your path clear from the start. You weren't having to worry about was going to do this or that or the other. Some of the guests had taken more meandering kind of a route, although some are more self-reflective than other. I had somebody on recently who's the CEO of a company called Doc Health, and his name is Michael Doctor, and he is a doctor. And I said, "How did you decide you wanted to become a doctor?" And he actually thought it had been something that had taken him a while. But like, your name was Doctor to begin with, so you already were a doctor when you were 2 seconds old. Never mind that your parents were physicians as well.
That's true.
Good. So McKinsey. So what was I mean, obviously, at the time, coming out of Stanford, McKinsey was a typical path. But how did you get your head around that? Did you see role models there? Did you feel that something that you learned earlier, in graduate school or early part of your career, driven you to start back into consulting?
Right. My whole point in going to business school was to round out a business education. And as you said, McKinsey was something I was familiar with. I, in fact, have an older brother who was at McKinsey at the time. He left shortly after I joined. But it was quite an attractive option for me coming out of business school. And McKinsey was a terrific place. I thought I would be there for 3 or 4 years with the clear intent of learning enough about business and getting enough exposure to business concepts to then start a software company. But I was having a terrific time learning and growing a lot. And 3 years became 5, became 10, became 18, until finally I was pretty clear that I wanted to go start a company.
Yeah, that's exciting. I actually had exposure. My first exposure to McKinsey was I was given a summer job there because I wanted as part of a prize in college, and I was first time I'd ever been out of the country. I was in London at the McKinsey office there, which was pretty interesting, and I did consulting after that, and I'm still doing it. But I after business school myself, I went to Boston Consulting Group, and I sort of thought, okay, 2 years, but then actually they kept giving me new challenges, and I kept growing, and I didn't feel I was plateauing, although I lasted only about 7 years. There, not 18, but still, it was a great place to be from. Terrific training ground, and I don't feel I lost. I feel like I lost any opportunity by being there. And a lot of our clients and people that we work with today are from BCG, and some from McKinsey as well, which is terrific. Now, sometimes people say that that the consulting doesn't give you the best preparation for entrepreneurship. It sounds like you had it in mind that you were going to do some work in consulting to prepare yourself for that. So how did you think about, the big consulting route then leading into entrepreneurship?
Well, McKinsey is fantastic leadership training and it's fantastic client development skills and instincts, and an ability to think broad strategically. And I focus on operations. So I led McKinsey's lean manufacturing practice in North America, along with two other people, created McKinsey's lean service operations practice in the US. And like any good deed that doesn't go unpunished, I was shipped off to Asia to go run the operations practices in Asia.
Yeah.
And so I learned a lot about operations and about consulting, about client management. You're right, there's a whole bunch of things you don't learn about in startup land just because your exposure is to larger organizations. Your clients tend to be Fortune 50, Fortune 100 companies. And so, for instance, when I started the company, I didn't really know what a cap table was. I roughly had the concept of there
Yeah.
are shares and people have it, but this whole notion of Series A, Series B, and how you do pre-money and post-money were all stuff I was figuring out as I went. Luckily, over the years, I have built a very strong network of advisors and ex-McKinsey people who had started companies and who were very good friends still. They invested in the seed round, and I leaned on them a lot to get help as I went.
Great. Is that why the company's called Lean TaaS, or is there another reason for lean?
No, the reason I called it Lean TaaS was my whole concept on starting the company was to develop and deliver lean transformations, but to deliver it on a software as a service platform. Because my exposure from having run hundreds of lean transformation programs on many continents and lots of clients was there were two shortcomings as I saw it. One was all lean performance transformations were built on Excel spreadsheets. And at the end of the day, Excel is middle school math. If you
Yeah.
use middle school math, you'll get middle school answers, was kind of one premise I had. And the second premise was consulting is great, the impact is great, but the impact tends to atrophy. So if you go back to any consulting project, even a wildly successful one, 5 or 6 years later, you find they've snapped back to their old way of doing things. And my rationale for why that happens is because consultants don't have a day job. They've got a project job. So they've got all the time in the world to build out the Gantt charts, the steering committees, the tracking, the to-do list, the follow-ups, the memos. Once they leave, the executives have got full plates already. And so they tend to fall off the wagon on all of those things. So my vision on Lean TaaS was imagine if you could deliver a lean transformation, replace Excel math with sophisticated data science, optimization, simulation, machine learning, AI, etc. And instead of feet on the street delivering the value, have it delivered through a SaaS platform, which absorbs the data, develops the analytics, updates it in real time, provides recommendations, learns as it goes, etc. And so that was the vision of Lean TaaS.
So it's interesting. So it sounds like you went back to things that you had your grounding in from your more technical education, plus what you learned in business school and at McKinsey. And so McKinsey wasn't so much just a preparation to run a software firm, but I think being there for that long, you had the kind of the domain expertise and the understanding of how these sort of transformations actually occur in companies. And then I guess regression to the mean, I guess that's a basic enough Excel concept. Things can sort of fall back to how they work. So it was all probably you got more out of it than you expected to be able to have those insights to take it to the next level.
Actually, there was one pivotal conversation that forced me to do that. Silicon Valley, right? Any cocktail party or dinner party you go to, you run into dozens of people who've started companies, sold companies, taken them public. And I was at one of these and I met this guy. I don't know his name. That's the one and only time I met him. And he said,
Yeah.
"What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm at McKinsey now, but I've already indicated I'm leaving and I'm going to start a software company. I still don't know what exactly it's going to be. I'm figuring it out." And he just looked at me and said, "That's a pretty bold leap." And I was, "Why do you say that?" And he says, "Well, you're a senior director at McKinsey. So today, if you want to get on the calendar of any chief executive, it's either in your Rolodex or you can reach out to a McKinsey partner who'll get you in front of that chief executive. The day after you start your company, you're just a guy in Silicon Valley, no product, no technology, no funding, no customers, no IP. Who's going to see you?" And that thought rattled in my head for a long time because I felt he's exactly right. And so the way I bridged it was, therefore, the company had to be something that could leverage the skills that have taken me 20 years to build, and yet be something disruptive and distinctive in the software space. And so, in some sense, it was a very helpful and pivotal conversation because it narrowed my domain from all the million possible software companies you can start to a thematic software company with a very clear mission and purpose.
So if you saw this guy, do you think you would recognize him? And do you think he goes around to cocktail parties and just seeds this little pixie dust everywhere and everyone's so successful like you?
I would not recognize the guy in a police lineup. I have no idea. So.
Great. Now, so it sounds like in terms, you already answered part of my next question about how things kind of got started. Presumably, you learned what a cap table was, and all the different pieces that you didn't have at McKinsey. And there's a lot of people around there. Now, of course, in my world, I think everything is healthcare, right? So we talk about the budget; it's all about healthcare. Climate change is about healthcare. Everything's about healthcare. But your company decided to focus on healthcare as well, which is not necessarily something I would have expected from your operational and software background. Why the focus on healthcare?
Actually, it took us 5 years to get to that point. So I started Lean TaaS and said, this will be easy. I'll go raise venture funding and we're off to the races. So through my Rolodex and the Rolodex of friends, I saw virtually every venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road. I mean, it's amazing. You've got $2 trillion of investment on a 2-mile stretch of road,
Yeah.
right? And I had a dozen meetings lined up. They all took the meeting. They were all quite excited about this vision of replacing Excel and transforming lean operations. No one took a second meeting, not one of them. After the first one and the second one, I said, these guys don't get it because it's operational and this is Silicon Valley. They don't understand operations, so I let it go. By the third or the fourth one, I realized that perhaps I don't get it. But I still went through the motions of all 10, and sure enough, nobody took a second meeting. And so I called a few of them back and said, I'm not trying to get you to change your mind, but help me understand why you said no. And they said, your scope is too broad. You're trying to take on lean transformation. You don't have an industry's focus. You don't have a specific use case. You don't have a clear vision of who your buyer and user are. And therefore, we see the end state of this as a tech-enabled consulting business, not a venture-backed business. So we don't see a pathway for you ever building $1 billion valuation company. And that was a tough message, but a very useful message. And so that immediately forced me to say, what we need to do is raise seed money to prove out the use case. And once we prove out a set of use cases, the scalable answer will emerge. And we need to build something that's not a tech-enabled services business. And so I'd raised seed money from 20 friends and family, many current and former McKinsey partners, who wrote checks of $50,000 to $100,000. Few people wrote 100, many people wrote 50, some wrote 25. Collectively, only about $1.25 million or so. And the funny part about raising $1 million of seed money is the day you raise it, it feels like a lot of money. 24 hours later, it doesn't feel like a lot of money because you run the math and say, great, if I hire 10 engineers and pay them for a year, that's gone. And you won't have a product at the end of it. So it became clear it wasn't enough to build a scalable product, but it was enough to bootstrap us. Luckily, we realized that within 24 hours and not 10 months into it, where we were burnt through most of the seed. And so we pivoted immediately and said, we need to bootstrap. You need revenue to bootstrap. The easiest source of revenue is consulting dollars. But if we do random consulting projects like organizational behavior or top team strategy workshops, we'll get the revenue, but we won't be any closer on our path. And so we focused on saying, let's land consulting projects that meet 3 criteria. 1, operationally complex. So we are doing an operationally complex thing. 2, a continuous data feed because it needs to be refreshed. And 3, a web-based app that they continue to use on a daily basis after the project is done. Therefore, they will use it. With that model, it was very successful. In the first 3 or 4 years, we had 15 or 20 iconic customers, Google, Flextronics, Home Depot, Clorox, companies of that ilk who I could get access to, tell them the vision and get started. But none of them were truly scalable, right? It so happened that one of those use cases was solving Infusion scheduling at Stanford. They approached us and said, we've got a problem. The Infusion center is empty in the morning, empty in the evening, and it's like a train station in the middle of the day. We keep hiring more and more nurses, but it doesn't solve the problem. you guys have worked on similar things before because we had optimized the allocation of dealers to blackjack tables at a casino.
Yeah.
And that's a complex supply demand optimization algorithm. So we said, sure, we can modify that. And within 5 months or so, we had improved their capacity by 15%, cut the wait time by 50%, eliminated nursing overtime, and eliminated nurses missing lunch. And we said, this is scalable. And so, because every infusion center we figured had this problem,
Right.
we did deep market research. I called two friends who were in health systems and said, hey, do you guys have this problem in infusion? And both said,
Yeah.
oh, 2 for 2. And I figured that's enough.
Yep.
And luckily at that time, I connected with Sanjeev, who's now our chief operating officer. He was Google's first head of product marketing. And he knew exactly how to build a scalable company. So literally within a week, he said, let's shed most of our applications and focus on the one and pivot the whole company towards that, which is a tough decision, but the right one. And so over the next 9 to 12 months, we handed off those other applications to third parties so they could continue serving the clients and pivoted the entire company to healthcare, raised 15 million in strategic funding, and then just scaled the company and then raised 200 more over the next several years after that.
Yeah, terrific. Well, the idea of the infusion center scheduling is one that I'm sure you've solved in a number of places, but it remains. Even just this week, I tried to schedule a relative for an infusion, and it was impossible. So, and it's like, and you mentioned the casino. It's more profitable than a casino, not necessarily for the hospital, but certainly for the drug company. So it's a good place to to be focused.
It is. And it's a deceptive problem because you would think, how hard can it be? You put a patient in a chair, you hang a bag of drugs, you connect it to their port or injection, and the medication flows for 2 or 3 hours and they leave. How hard can it be to schedule? Well, it turns out it's incredibly hard to schedule for a bunch of reasons, right? Chemo regimens are 6 or 8 weeks. So by definition, 15% of your patient base on any given day is either in their first week of chemo or in their last week of chemo. So it's a continuously changing patient mix. From time to time, the length of the treatment is different. You need drugs, you need pumps, you need nurses, you need chairs. Scheduling amidst all that uncertainty is very hard. And health systems were scheduling it as if it's a tennis court. You look at the calendar and say,
Yeah.
David, you get 9 to 10, Travis, you get 10 to 11. It doesn't work like that. And so we've solved that problem in a compelling way. Today, we control 15% of the infusion capacity in the US already.
Terrific. And so how, once you got into healthcare, how narrow is the focus within healthcare? Because of course, healthcare itself is, 20+% part of the economy at this point. So do you think about, how do you do everything as sort of related to that same infusion center kind of a problem, or how do you think about it?
So there are many bright lines or bright red lines that you should be clear on in healthcare. Otherwise, you can meander and try and be all things to all people, and it simply doesn't work. So the one bright line we draw is we are operational optimization, not clinical. We don't pretend that we've got medical staff that can make better cancer diagnosis decisions or read radiology charts better than a radiologist, etc. So we do nothing clinical. We are operational optimization. Even within the operational optimization, what we do is we focus on the assets that are just not well enough utilized. And when you think about the most expensive assets in a health system, operating rooms, inpatient beds, infusion chairs, imaging machines, each of these is an optimization problem screaming to be solved. Because collectively across the US, there are $2 trillion worth of assets, not counting real estate. The average hospital has $400 or $500 million of assets. An operating room is $20 million, for example. And it's parked in the most expensive real estate in the world, Manhattan, Palo Alto. So imagine a $20 million room sitting in the most expensive dirt in the country and not being well utilized.
Right.
If you could unlock 10% of asset utilization across the country, that unlocks $200 billion of value a year, which is material by just staying focused on that. So our vision is one asset at a time, crush the math of supply-demand imbalances, topology to link the various steps of a medical process together, and thereby create value.
So when you look at this type of a problem, like if you're looking at where the optimization opportunities are, and you look across the economy, and you focus on something like healthcare, and you say, this is just screaming for attention. How does it look from the other side? So if I'm a CEO of, say, a big hospital, integrated delivery network, how high is optimization of assets on my list? Like how high does it rise on their list in terms of
Very
strategic
high
priorities?
because there are a few assets that are the economic engine of a health system. So, for instance, an operating room generates 40 to 50% of the revenue of a health system, generates 50 to 60% of the profits of a health system. Beds are always in short supply. And what COVID did was amplify that if you don't manage your assets correctly, you have bottlenecks, you run out of capacity, you have shortfalls. And so they're quite aware of the need to improve it and increasingly becoming aware that their paper and pencil, Excel spreadsheet, and calendar based methods are inadequate. And so what we tend to do is we show them other complex asset intensive industries. UPS ships 20 million packages a day. They have no idea that I'm going to get out of the house this afternoon and ship a package from here to New York. They can't possibly predict that.
Right.
But yet they have to have their planes, their trucks, their vans, their sorting hubs, and their routes pre-orchestrated and pre-managed. And so in the face of a volatile demand and a semi-fixed supply, they have to still make the math work. Delta Airlines puts on 5,000 flights a day. Each flight has 200 seats. So, and they allow you to buy tickets 300 days into the future. So think about what they have to do they can't possibly predict I'm going to decide that I need to go to New York in September.
Right.
And yet they have to manage the levers of demand and supply, yield management, pricing, chair configuration, seat configuration to make it all work. So when we show health systems that the math is possible and sophisticated math leads to better decisions, not admiring the problem, not just looking at the dashboard for how you did yesterday, but actually solving it, it can unlock a lot of value.
Now, you mentioned the pandemic, and although I like to talk about the pandemic, it also brings up Google's algorithms, which are a little bit stupid and try to like suppress us because we're talking about something that's sensitive. But we'll have to live with that on the podcast. What were some of the things that you saw during the pandemic? Certainly, I think that somebody who was running a hospital and hadn't been focused before on capacity, constraints was at the time. But what were sort of the broader lessons, and what did you learn during the pandemic?
So the first thing was that the system runs on the edge. And when you run on the edge, your ability to withstand a shock is very limited.
Yeah.
So think back to college days when you lived on a $500 budget and you spent $499. You didn't have any give. There was no buffer in there.
Yeah.
So your transmission falling out was a catastrophic event at that point in time, even though it was a $200 issue, right? So when you run close to the edge, and this happens in all systems, freeways at rush hour run close to the edge. One accident will throw everything into a tailspin, right? Hospitals realized they were running on the edge. So the way it manifested, initially PPE was the problem. They thought they had plenty of PPE, but not for such a contagious airborne virus that they were running out of masks, they were reusing masks, etc. It took 3 or 4 months for that supply chain kink to work itself out. Then ventilators became a problem. And it was very easy to blame the hospitals for not having ventilators. But actually, many of the health systems I talked to had 50 ventilators. On a given day, they used 5. So they had 10 extra capacity. The problem was they needed 200. And so suddenly having 50 was not good enough. And it was easy to finger point. Then they ran out of ICU beds. Then they ran out of regular beds. Meanwhile, the staff is falling off. So the capacity, because the staff is either overworked or tired or themselves sick or caring for a sick one. And so they started to realize that the supply-demand shock balance is actually a harder problem to solve than they had expected, which in a way makes our messaging today resonate that much more because they realize, you know what, the supply-demand balancing stuff is not that easy.
Mm-hmm.
It takes millions of dollars and years of mathematical and software expertise to build. And therefore, in that sense, the messages have resonated for us.
Great. Now, what you just announced relatively recently, I think, raising a Series D, which you now know what these series mean, and $150 million is, if I'm doing the math right, 100 times bigger than your first raise that you were doing. I assume you can't grow exponentially from there, but what why the size of such a round, and how, when you look out to the future, what does that mean? You're going to raise money forever, or where are you heading?
It's it's exactly 100 times. It was 130 million, and the first one was 1.3 million. So you're right. I
Got
hadn't thought about the 100x ratio, but
it.
I like that actually. I'm gonna file that away and use it.
Good.
Um,
And
so
you'll remember who told you that one, right?
I will certainly
So
remember
okay.
that. So a couple of things. One, Insight Partners has been a fantastic partner. They backed us from their first investment was in November of 2017. They doubled down and invested again in 2018. They invested again in 2019. So they have invested. The participation in this round was their fourth participation. So they believe in the vision. They believe in our execution. They've got confidence in the leadership team, and they love our traction. So they wanted to keep doubling down and do more. The reason we raised a very large round is we've got momentum on a bunch of fronts, and we felt that it's time to double down and really do it. So we'd done a little alpha test on an inpatient bed solution. And yes, we could incrementally grow and develop it, or else we could say, look, we think there are 1 million beds in the US. The opportunity to fundamentally transform how beds are managed is in front of us. And we shouldn't not be aggressive just because of cash. We've got Insight and Goldman, both of whom have the willingness and ability to invest extraordinary sums of money. And so doubling down on beds and really accelerating it was big. And so even in the short time since December, we've taken it from an alpha proof of concept to now we are controlling 15 hospitals and 4,000 beds. It's still early. We'll get to 20 and 30,000 beds in the next 18 to 24 months, but that's a sign for how we were able to leverage the investment and accelerate it. Both the OR and the Infusion product are enormously successful. As I said, Infusion controls 15% of the chair capacity. ORs, we control over 2,000 ORs at 300 facilities across the country. And there's a lot we could do on investing and pushing it further, taking on more of the workflow, sharpening the algorithms, providing more functionality. And so we're doubling down on all of that. We had not really invested in our marketing and go-to-market activities. We were still subscale on that front. And so by doing this, we've now invested in that as well. Our marketing team is 2 to 3x bigger than it was even 8 months ago. And we're doing the same thing on our field-based sales team. We are on a hiring rampage here, and we will fundamentally transform that as well. And so we had plenty of use for it. Plus, because the seed investors had come in very early, like in 2010, this was a very good opportunity to give our seed investors an opportunity to cash out because they've been in it a long time. And I've got 20 very good friends now because people who put in $50,000 pulled a substantial return on investment, 20 or 25 times their money. And it was great. Some of them chose to stay in even for the next round, and some of them said, you know what, it's been a great run. I'm happy to cash out. And some of them did a bit of both, cashed out a little bit and left a little bit. And we were happy to provide that opportunity for liquidity. So the round was large because we did allow for a secondary portion as well.
Now, you talked a lot about kind of what you learned, along the way in your education and in your various jobs and from McKinsey. A lot you learned in consulting that sounds like very useful for what you're doing. Are there things that you've learned now as a CEO that you wish you knew as a consultant? And this is sort of a selfish question since I am a consultant. So,
I wish I had a better appreciation for the share of mind of a CEO, which I don't think I did as a consultant. Because as a consultant, when I was working with a client, that project was 100% of my life. I, lived it, slept it, dreamt it, obsessed about it 24/7. And so I knew the CEO had a few other things to do, but I assumed it would be very top of mind. And now I realize that even a very important priority cannot occupy. There are 100 other things going on.
Yeah.
There's contractual stuff, there's legal stuff, there's people stuff, there's culture things, there's strategy, there's organization, there's operations. There's so much going on that it's very hard to fully dedicate time to even an important initiative. And I think had I known that, I would have been more effective at framing the so whats, orchestrating the conversations to be more efficient of their time, give them the 2-minute soundbite that they could use more effectively. I think I'd have been a better consultant if I'd been in these shoes as long as I have back when I was a consultant.
Great. Well, now that you are CEO, any time for reading and anything that you want to recommend for listeners?
Um, I have become functionally illiterate outside of business books. I just don't have time. So what I tend to do is one of two things. I'll either listen to audiobooks. So driving to and from the office, of course, I'm doing that a lot less too. But driving to and from the office, I'd get the audiobooks, or I'd get the ebook and read it on my iPad. So what have I read lately that I found particularly compelling? I read The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. Truly amazing book. It was fantastic. Then I just finished Unscaled, which was a completely counterintuitive concept to me. A guy called Hemant Taneja, where this notion of super personalization, everything going down to a level of one, like diabetes drugs aimed at one person or diabetes care regimen. So this concept of completely flipping on its head the economies of scale. Unscaled was a completely counterintuitive one. And I just picked up Empowered by Marty Kagan, Silicon Valley Product Group. It's how do you empower your product groups to take on and do bigger things. I've just started it, so I'm not deep into it. So my pace with books is slow. I'll read a chapter or two, and then I might not touch it for a month, and then pick it up again.
So, I ask everybody that I interview about their books, and the hard thing about hard things has about 25% share among people on the podcast recommending it. So I actually read it myself. So it's a good one.
It's a brilliant book. It's a brilliant book.
Good.
But obviously, you wouldn't expect any less from Ben Horowitz.
No,
So
exactly. No, it's a really good one. Well, Mohan Giridharadas, founder and CEO of Lean TaaS, thank you very much for spending time with me today on the Health Biz Podcast.
thank you, David. It was fun.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.